Hello, memoirists and reporters, storytellers and researchers. I'm Grant Faulkner, and I'm here with my podcasting co-host, Brooke Warner. And Brooke, I'm excited to talk with our guest, Beth Macy, today for personal reasons. You know, every one of our episodes definitely draws out something personal for me, but today's episode very directly and tangibly does. Beth is my age, and we both grew up in similar places, small towns in the Midwest. We both went to college and then moved away from our hometowns, and we each experienced, alienation and estrangement as our towns changed so dramatically in the last 30 to 40 years. And it's not only the red and blue political divide, but there are other things going on as well. I think it's very much rural versus urban, educated versus uneducated. And then we're all getting our news from such wildly different sources. So we're really experiencing different worlds. And Beth grew up differently than me, though, in one significant way. She grew up poor, so she's even closer to the divide than I've been because it's just part of the fabric of her family. And her memoir, Paper Girl, is a very personal memoir, but it's also full of societal research and analysis and reportage, and because she's a journalist. And for me, this blend of personal writing with reporting was really enlightening because I now see my hometown in a new light, and I feel like I understand more about what poverty is. And then I've now become sort of a PhD student of this practically unfathomable divide that we're experiencing in this country.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I relate to that just in terms of how much we take in and in trying to understand what is going on in this country. I didn't grow up in a small town in the Midwest like both of you, but I understand this divide, and certainly with a new depth because of a book like Beth's, and other books that I've read as well. I actually recently read that J.D. Vance's family depended on food assistance, SNAP, very much in the news lately while growing up, which just makes it so cruelly ironic that he is a force blocking the opening up of those funds as we are recording this. I mean, I desperately hope that those people will get what they need. He famously wrote the memoir Hillbilly Elegy, of course, and Vance grew up just an hour away from Beth Macy, but he had quite a different perspective, has quite a different perspective than Beth. Vance blames much of his hometown's misfortunes on its residents, emphasizing that they're doing little to improve their plight. He doesn't seem to think that they're caught in the vicious cycle of systems that they can't escape, like globalization. And so for me, it was very refreshing to read about how Beth investigates systems that have historically marginalized people in Appalachia and other left behind communities, especially in light of someone like Vance, who has sort of become the poster child for that. And I think it's been, sort of changing the conversation in very problematic ways. We talk about, issues in the interview, like disappearance of local journalism, declining schools, mental health crises, and the rise of conspiracy theories. And so I appreciate so much Beth's effort to get out of her bubble and open herself up to the plights of these people that she was writing about, really curious about them and their thoughts instead of just blaming them for their misfortunes.
Yeah, I loved how reading her book, you could just feel her open, curious mind on the page. And as I mentioned, I share a lot with Beth, and our towns are similar, but I was one of the haves. I always say that one thing that is interesting about growing up in a small town, though, is that the classes kind of merge more than they do in big cities because we all went to the same school for one, and then we shopped at the same grocery store and we got our hair cut at the same barbershop. So I grew up very close to poverty and with poor kids who were with me from K through 12, but I was, still distant from it, certainly as compared to Beth. So one enlightening thing out of the book for me was getting an inside look at the day-to-day nature of being poor and how that swallows a person, and swallows even exceptional people. Someone says to Beth that 2 weeks is an eternity for individuals who need money to feed their families. And that speaks to how much effort poor people have to put into surviving the moment. It's often referred to as the mental bandwidth tax. Poverty requires just constant mental calculation. You're counting every calorie, you need food, you're counting every penny, to ensure resources don't run out. And this creates this chronic cognitive load that leaves very little space for planning ahead or for creativity or even joy. And people describe poverty as being like treading water. You're not moving forward. You're just using all of your energy to keep your head above water. And it was also interesting to me to understand how people who live in high poverty neighborhoods experience, really elevated worry actually at rates of up to 6 times higher than the general population. And this isn't the occasional stress that you and I might feel. It's constant vigilance about threats to basic security. And it's obviously part of the mental illness and suicide and drug use in poor communities. So, you're just naturally more inclined to seek short-term rewards because delaying gratification becomes, genuinely harder. And Beth touches on that with the kind of main character of this memoir, Silas James.
It's such a big deal that we think about these bigger picture issues, especially when we're at such an arm's length because of the reverberations and the ramifications. People are in survival mode. They're paying attention to what's immediately in front of them. And, just understanding these issues, I think makes us more compassionate, one would hope. Beth did research on poverty, but she also does a wonderful job of telling the personal story of it, her own story. But also through this exceptional boy that you just mentioned, Silas, who is essentially what she calls a mirror to her own story. But she shows how much harder escaping poverty has become, by showing how much harder it is for him as opposed to how hard it was for her or the legs up she was given. Silas graduates in 2023 from Urbana High School, and Beth calls him a modern day me because he's all the things she was: talented, college bound. But Silas's circumstances are harrowing in ways that Beth's were not, because he was homeless for most of his junior and senior years. His mother was in jail on drug charges. His father died of a methadone overdose. And then Silas became the guardian and de facto parent for his half siblings. Silas is also trans, and so there's just all kinds of trauma that has been compounded for him. And then the journey is riveting and tragic, both because he does make it into college, but then he has to drop out because his car breaks down and he can't rely on transportation. I mean, all of these things that he faces. And Beth is saying, look, at my age, or rather when I was his age, the Pell Grant program was much better funded. Beth was able to go to college without that kind of hardship. She's going to speak to that in the interview. So the support systems that helped Beth escape poverty in the 80s are no longer sufficient for people like Silas today. And I think she just really wanted to shine a light on that. It's very heartbreaking, though, Grant.
Completely heartbreaking. People are so stuck in poverty, and they're so difficult to get out of it. And my analysis of what happened to my hometown, Oskaloosa, Iowa, is that previous generations of kids, previous to me, they might go to college, but then most likely they would move back to town and essentially become professionals and town leaders of some sort. And my father, for example, who was the first one to go to college in his family, and he became a lawyer, and he actually saved an office in his law firm for my brother and I, to return after college. And he literally saved it for a couple of decades just in case we decided to come back. But really beginning with my high school class, so many of those who went to college just left the state, or they certainly left the towns and moved to cities like Des Moines. And it's a very American thing, right, to always be moving to someplace that seems better or more prosperous. But there's been a big drain of college-educated people throughout the Midwest. And I think that has affected a lot of things, like just the way schools and libraries are run and new businesses and job growth. And Beth is like me, when she went to college, she didn't return to her hometown. I don't know if I knew kids exactly like Silas growing up, but I had a number of very smart and exceptional classmates who didn't go to college because they just didn't have a support system or encouragement to do so like I did. And I've watched a number of my poor classmates die early deaths. And the town square I grew up with, I think it essentially shifted to Walmart, which is on the edge of town. So, Walmart functions as a town square. If you want to go see someone in town, you'll likely see them in Walmart, even though we have this beautiful town square with a bandstand. And I think the big thing separating Oskaloosa with Urbana is that it is the rare Midwestern small town where there are a few thriving factories and businesses. So it hasn't frayed as much at the edges. It's still frayed though. And I always experience a bit of culture shock when I go home.
Gosh, I can only imagine. Yeah. And that in and of itself is kind of sad, just the shifts of where people hang out and sort of the consumerism and big box stores and all of that stuff. Beth did a Buy the Book interview with the New York Times a while ago, and she was asked what moves her most in a work of literature. And she said that she thinks constantly of Bryan Stevenson's grandmother telling him, and this is quoted in the introduction of Stevenson's memoir, Just Mercy, "You can't understand most of the important things from a distance, Bryan. You have to get close." And that to me sums up Beth's book. She got close to herself and to her family story. She also got close to Urbana and what might be called, I think, Grant, we have to maybe reclassify this as the American nightmare rather than the American dream that so many of us are promised.
Yeah, nightmare is definitely right, because like Beth, I've had faith that if we're kind, loving people who create kind, loving conversations based in curiosity, if we listen more than we yell, then maybe, just maybe, we can heal our divides. At the same time, though, I've strenuously practiced that, and when I do, I haven't really succeeded. And that divide is such a stubborn thing for a bunch of reasons, and some of them good reasons, considering like what is happening economically to a lot of people. But that divide is also, an angry thing as a result, and an endlessly frustrating thing. And I got to tell the truth, I oftentimes don't see a way out, because this national argument we're having isn't just about what's happening now, but it can be traced back hundreds of years, and it's certainly still fueled by the Civil War of all things. But that's all why we need efforts like Beth's. We need people like her to get close, because she brought me closer to some things I thought I was already close to. And I loved her answer to the solution to all of this, and how she focused on grace and tenderness and gentleness, all those things. It was a good reminder.
Yeah, for sure. And these are very tough issues, but important ones to get close to. So get ready for a great interview, everyone. We will be back in just a moment with our interviewee, Beth Macy.
Well, Brooke, I'm always so pleased when we have a sponsor whose products and services I've actually used and enjoyed independently. And that's the case with Gotham Writers Workshop. I took my first class with them nearly 20 years ago, and it was an online class, my first online class ever. And I had my MFA at the time, and I have to say that my Gotham class was as good as any of my MFA classes. And in fact, the great writer Manuel Gonzalez taught it. But it wasn't just about Manuel. All of the students in the course were super smart and really good writers. And amazingly enough, I'm still in touch with some of them. So I wholeheartedly recommend taking any of Gotham's courses.
I love that so much. And Gotham definitely has a high pedigree, and it's been around for a long time. They offer creative writing classes in New York City, but also over Zoom, and also asynchronous classes that you can take online. And so you can be anywhere in the world. And they have an amazing breadth of offerings, Grant. They offer memoir classes, woohoo, but also other nonfiction, as well as fiction, poetry, songwriting, and many others, and with super qualified instructors and for an affordable price.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, they are very much about community, so you can stay involved with Gotham in a number of ways, and they even put on conferences. And writers often ask me how to find a writing group or beta reader, and I think taking a class is a great way to find good writing partner matches. So develop your craft and join a vibrant community of writers at Gotham Writers Workshop.
Yes, you can find them at gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting. Use our code, please, Memoir Nation at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply there, but definitely go check it out. And so endorse them, Grant.
Yeah. So one more time, visit gothamwriters.com to see what classes are starting soon, and use the code Memoir Nation, all one word, Memoir and Nation with no space between them, at checkout for $40 off your first 6 or 10-week class. Some restrictions apply. And tell them that Grant sent you, and Brooke too. Welcome back, everybody. I am very excited to introduce Beth Macy. Beth reported and wrote for the Roanoke Times for a quarter century before leaving in 2014 to focus on book writing. And thank God she did, because she's written some very important books, including Dopesick, Raising Lazarus, and Factory Man, all of which examine, the forces that are eroding American society, such as addiction and offshoring and economic inequality, among other things. And her new memoir, Paper Girl, is perhaps her most personal work. She grew up in Urbana, Ohio in the 70s and 80s, where she worked as the town's paper girl, delivering the local newspaper. And she was often among the poorest students in her class. You know, she was born to a hardworking and frugal mother and an abusive and alcoholic father. But she was able to attend Bowling Green State University in 1982, thanks to a Pell Grant that covered her entire education. And that Pell Grant served the world well because Beth has won more than 24 national journalism awards, including a Nieman Fellowship for Journalism at Harvard University, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Dopesick, which was made into a Peabody Award-winning series for Hulu. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you. Great. Thanks, Brooke. Great to meet you guys.
So nice to meet you because, you know, in 7 years on this podcast, I don't think I've interviewed anyone who has lived a life as parallel to mine as yours. So I'm super excited to talk with you. I feel like this book is just so important in understanding what is going on in this country because you, like me, are a type of bridge. You know, you grew up in a small Midwestern town that has changed into a Trump QAnon town. But you left that town and became an urban elite, for lack of a better term, but you care about it all. You're trying to be kind and understanding and compassionate, which is hard these days. So I was wondering, can you tell us why you decided to write this book and then why you titled it Paper Girl?
Yeah. So I titled it Paper Girl because I delivered the paper as a little kid, and then I wrote for newspapers for many years. And this idea that we were going into these vastly separated silos started to occur to me in the 20-teens when I was visiting my relatives in Ohio. And the first person that it came up with was my brother-in-law, John, very conservative. But, you know, we could always have conversations, but I'd come home and I'd go, "Hey, John, how you doing?" And he'd go, "Deplorable," and try to goad me into an argument. And then my brother, Tim, who I was closer to, 9 years my senior, unfriended me on Facebook during Trump's first administration, ended up missing an invitation I had given him to our kids' High School Musical, which he had always come to previously. And then when I asked him why he unfriended me, and he said it was because of all the liberal crap you post. And that really stung me because I'm pretty careful about what I post. I still consider myself a journalist, and I was posting fact-checked articles for the New York Times and Washington Post, some of which were articles that I wrote. And then the real pinnacle moment in terms of me trying to figure out what was happening with my family was our mother was dying, and it was the Saturday after the November election in 2020. And the hospice nurse called out, "Oh, they're calling it for Biden." And my evangelical sister, who had never previously expressed politics and with such vigor, shouted out, "No, you wait, it's fraudulent. He won't win." And I just thought, what the heck is happening to my hometown, which was once a heralded place on the Underground Railroad, and now there's Confederate flags. I mean, we were the Union, right? We've got a Union soldier in our town square. What's happening to my family, and what's happening to the country? And so, you know, I wrote a little bit about this. I wrote a piece in the New York Times, and it got a lot of traction. And I realized I wasn't the only one feeling like this. And so then I was able to go back and pitch this book as not just a memoir. I would say it's like a third memoir. I mean, I'm the glue throughout it because I'm the one connecting all the dots and interviewing all the people, but it's very heavily reported. Look at my life, the life of a young me, a promising but poor kid that I interviewed named Silas James, and then the town itself and how it had changed in the 40 years since I left.
Well, Beth, you really started to get into the next question that I want to ask you about. You just spoke to this reality that your hometown was once a proud stop on the Underground Railroad. And in the book, you write, "It's no longer unusual to drive through my hometown and see Confederate flags. I'd also clocked growing tension over politics among my family members and some of my oldest, dearest friends, most of whom now hated the media, even though they still loved me." And so you're talking about this fallout with your family, but I'm curious if you would share more about how your relationships with friends and others in the town have changed dramatically. I mean, maybe through the Trump years, but also I'm curious about the aftermath of the publication of this book.
I wound up thinking, after spending 2 years going back to my hometown for about a week a month, that my family wasn't as right as I thought. there were people much on the hard right, many more among my friends. And a high school reunion organizer who, was trying to turn me onto QAnon and said, now you've been red pilled, now you know, and didn't think Biden was alive when I was interviewing her during his presidency. That was an actor playing him with a face mask and all these crazy notions. My oldest, dearest friend, who is a lay minister who had conducted my mom's funeral, is Black and doesn't think that George Floyd was murdered by Derek Chauvin, and doesn't believe in Black Lives Matter and all sorts of other things that struck me as really shocking. That's just tip of the iceberg. I could go on. I interviewed an ex-boyfriend who was super liberal, and now right before my eyes, as I was completing the book, emerged as the leader in Springfield, Ohio, of the anti-Haitian contingent, where in the run-up to the 24 election, they're, quote, eating the pets, they're eating the cats. And there he is on PBS NewsHour. There he is on the front page of the paper. He is spouting great replacement theory and really nasty things. The reaction in my hometown has been mixed at my event, which was 2 days before the book came out. Everybody was super encouraging. I didn't get into like the super personal stuff in the event. My family was in the audience. They all came. They were super sweet. And my friends were great. But afterwards, a friend who I had depicted in accuracy, who was a conspiracist, was really upset with me and said I threw her under the bus. And that hurt. And, I apologized that she felt that way, but I was very clear with what I was doing, what I was set out to do. I recorded our interview and, I hope we can patch it back up, but I'm not sure. But also people need to be responsible for what they're out there saying in the world, and you said it, like, back it up. That's really hard. One of my sisters who also feels a bit thrown under the bus is upset with me about the book, but she, not so upset that she didn't come to my event. And, I don't know. I just think we have to keep trying to talk across this divide because it's going to destroy us if we don't.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, Beth, one instance of somebody needing to take responsibility for what they say is J.D. Vance. And it's an obvious book to compare yours to his book, Hillbilly Elegy. And Vance actually grew up about an hour away from you. And you've called him a hillbilly huckster because of all of the falsehoods he spread on the 2024 campaign trail and continues to spread. I was interested because The Atlantic ran a headline recently about your book. And the headline was "A Writer Who Did What Hillbilly Elegy Wouldn't." So I'm curious if you could tell us more about your take on Hillbilly Elegy, and did you see it as a reason to tell the story you've told here?
It wasn't part of the plan when I wrote the proposal or anything like that, but I certainly was very aware of it when I was writing Dopesick and spending a lot of time in Central Appalachia, where the opioid crisis first broke out. That was around the time his book was published, and all the activists I was interviewing were furious with it, saying, he wasn't a real hillbilly because he was from Ohio, and they didn't consider that hillbilly. Listen, I'm from Ohio; it's hillbilly, but whatever. But their main beef was that he blames poor people who've been victimized by out-of-state corporations for centuries on the fact that they're poor, or they just, if they simply worked harder or pulled up their bootstraps and were special snowflakes like he is, everything would be great. And so he doesn't really give you a systematic analysis of what's happened in his hometown. And that really infuriated much of Appalachia. They didn't, full of stereotypes. And this idea that a really bright person like J.D. Vance can go in the Army, come out, go to school for free on the GI Bill. That's fantastic. Get into law, get into Yale Law. Fantastic for him. But then go from Yale Law to I'm going to fix the opioid crisis in Ohio, doesn't do a darn thing, becomes a venture capitalist, becomes a politician under Trump, right after he calls Trump, what do you call him, cultural heroin, I mean, he's going for a power grab now, and he needs to be called out on that.
For sure. Yes. And thank you for that. And I want to circle back to Silas, who you mentioned earlier. You write very movingly about Silas James, a high school graduate who gets a scholarship to study for his welding certificate. And he also faces very tough odds. And just to share a little bit about his background, within his first week at community college, the old beater car that he's driving that he needs to commute blows a gasket. His father dies of a methadone overdose. His mother has been in and out of jail on drug charges. Silas is trans, so he's dealing with all of that backlash and abuse that comes with that experience, and then has to help raise his younger siblings. So it's just this uber challenge that he seems to face in all directions, and making it almost impossible to have a better life. And Silas is your mirror in this book, as you say. So can you comment on how the world supported your journey out of poverty in a way that, you know, is so different than what Silas faces?
Yeah, great question. So when I was graduating from high school in 1982, we were so poor that I got a full Pell Grant. It paid for my tuition, room and board, books. I got work study jobs. I worked 2 and 3 jobs for pizza and beer money. And once I was dropped off at a 4-year college, I could stay there. It's not like I had to commute 2 hours every day. Alternatively, because now the Pell Grant only covers about 30% of a poor kid's 4-year state institution, Silas has to go to a community college, which is great. I'm a firm believer in community college. I think it should be free, like universally free. And I think we should re-elevate the trades to where they deserve to be. Not everybody needs to do a 4-year. Silas would have been a great 4-year student, though, because he has the intellectual chops. So, but he's thinking, he's been advised to go into this welding program, and he even has a double scholarship to pay for it. But he doesn't really understand how the money works, in that he can only use one of the scholarships for tuition, but he's not allowed to use the other one for anything other than tuition. So it just sits there unused. He can't use it for transportation. He can't use it for an apartment so he could move nearby the community college. At this point, he lives an hour away, and that's a lot of wear and tear on a car. And the first week, his car dies. I watched him go through 5 clunker cars in the course of this 10-month program and 4 full-time jobs, because he has to help pay rent and all the expenses. I didn't have to do any of that. I didn't have to worry about what was going on at home. And, you know, one of the things my editor pointed out as we were going through the back and forth of this is that when you're able to get away from home and it's a chaotic environment or a not supportive environment, you can experience for the first time in your life maybe a peaceful environment. And that's what he didn't get. He just had to power right through, and he did ultimately. But there were a lot of stops and starts along the way.
Well, Beth, I want to go a little further with that because, you know, I think before the show, I was telling you how, you know, we'd led these parallel lives of growing up in small towns in the Midwest. I think one striking thing that was different or is different about our lives is that I grew up one of the haves, essentially, but alongside a lot of have-nots, you know, in my school. But poverty has risen a lot since I left my hometown. And that was one of the things that was really enlightening about your book, is how it deepened my concept of what it's like to be poor every day. You know, and there's this, somebody tells you that, you know, 2 weeks is essentially an eternity for a poor person. And if you're poor, you have to live so intensely in the moment just to survive, right?
Daily survival.
Yeah, it's all about daily survival. So somebody like Silas, it's really hard to think of a big picture, long-term plan, you know, because you're putting all of your mental energy into the day. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about that the nature of being poor and what that does to a person.
Yeah, there's a great study that I quote that it came up in Matthew Desmond's Poverty by America. And I looked it up, and basically it showed, like, you know, using economics and hard data, that being that kind of poor is equivalent of going without any sleep. Now, I don't know about y'all, but I can't function if I don't get at least 6 hours of sleep. And when you think about that and just all the different things they're wrestling with, and, you know, I saw Silas, like, he'd get a paycheck and he would blow it going to a punk concert or something like that. And it's this idea, like, he just really needed the stress relief, right, of that. And I didn't know how to handle money either when I first started getting a very lowly paycheck from a newspaper. And I mean, thank God I married my husband, who I jokingly call the cheapest man alive. He grew up very middle class, swimming pool in his backyard. His parents met at Cornell, just a totally different environment. But he was really good at not spending money, and that, which is why we're out of debt, right? We have no debt, which is a miracle to me. But in the other rule about being poor, as somebody I quote in the book says, like, if one of your friends who's poor also needs money, you have to give it. And you just, that if the rent's due the next day, you just figure it out then. And it is that shorter window of what is the future.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, your book also identifies larger forces at work keeping people in Urbana down. You do talk about the decline of the news, and you do that through the lens of your small town newspaper. And then this is especially poignant to you because you work there both as a delivery girl and then as a reporter. So I wondered if you could just give us your take on this decline of news as it reverberates, among these other issues that you were speaking to earlier.
Yeah, and that was really because I am such a lover of newspapers. I really think newspapers were once the glue of democracy, the glue of any community. And it's how you learned empathy for other people and your neighbors and what was going on, and shining, a bright light on corruption and holding power accountable, all those things. And it has just absolutely been decimated because of digital, because of Reagan abolishing the fairness doctrine, which made it so that if there was an opinion piece on radio or TV, there had to be an alternate opinion. So that went away in the 80s. And then in the 90s, as digital is exploding, we come up with this Communications Decency Act that makes it so that eventually companies like Meta and Facebook can allow lies to spread, unfettered lies to spread on social media, and not be held accountable for mistruths and exaggerations and outright lies. And so we just got out ahead of our skis on that by not regulating it like we should. It's not unlike what happened with the opioid crisis, right? It's like you let these millionaires who want to be billionaires just run roughshod over Americans. This is where you end up, in a place where we have this vast amount of misinformation circulating so quickly. We now know from an MIT study that lies spread 6 times faster than truth on social media. And that's why I can have a dear friend that I've known since kindergarten just believe these things that repulse me. And as she puts it in the book, yes, but how can we love each other beyond what we don't agree with or even understand? And that is really the profound question of the book.
It is, and it's the profound question that I was just getting ready to ask you, Beth. I really felt in the book, of course, and realize this in my life as well, that we're living in these intense bubbles, and even, but I had to reckon with things in the book, like you wrote about how many urban and suburban professionals don't see the harm or haven't seen the harm that the 92 NAFTA agreement did to communities such as Urbana. And I have to admit, I'm in that camp, so that was a wonderful realization for me to dig deeper into that. And at the same time, I have tried hard to get out of my bubble. I've tried hard to create conversations with the MAGA friends I grew up with, but I'm not sure if I know a way out of the bubble, because I see the country not just as red and blue, but as rural versus urban and educated versus uneducated. And then, as you mentioned, we get our news, we get it from wildly different sources. So our basic views of the world is just, they're just so different. And you delved into the problems, with such a depth of perspective that I haven't encountered before in this book. So I wonder if you could go further with what you think the solution might be. And then, is that solution possible?
I'm not sure it's scalable, but I think we have to try. So I interviewed a lot of experts about how to conduct these conversations across the political divide. And, one of the first things they said was, don't just go in talking politics, get to know your family again as people and who you are. Show up for them, spend time with them. Don't bring politics up. If they come up, try to change the conversation such that what is it about your family that you do admire and you do celebrate? And in my family, it's our mother, who died in 2020, who was so feisty and so, so funny and so spirited. And, the things we used to love to do when she was still alive, we played cards, we drank beer, we might have gambled a little bit on the card games. And we were really into food. We loved fishing. So like, what among these things can we still be proud of and still do together? And sometimes it worked out great. Like in the example of my brother that I talked about earlier, we were able to patch it back up by spending time together. I invited him to this little cabin we bought in the mountains up in Virginia, right on a creek. And he reminded me how to fish, which I hadn't done since I was a kid. And, we had a great time. And we learned how to talk about hard things again together. Although I still, if he brings politics up, I don't go there with him because I know we're just going to get upset. But for instance, he asked about our youngest who had recently come out as non-binary. And he said, well, what's that mean? Does he still date girls? And instead of like going 0 to 60, like you misgendered him or whatever, I showed him grace. And because I just did that instinctively because he asked with such a curious, nice tone. And he's a very tender person. So I asked, or I answered in the same tone in which he had asked the question. Yes, they're dating a young woman now. Yes. And I sometimes mess up the pronouns too, because I do. It's very hard. And I know people who are trans. My brother doesn't know people who are trans or non-binary. So we have to start to extend grace to people that don't have the experience that we have. I did a lot of interviews with people who like teach rural urban divide training sessions. And, one of the things, they say some of the same things I just said, but they talk about like just listening really carefully and mirroring back what the person said, but maybe with the most generous take on it. And so when my friend Joy says, I think kids are identifying as cats and bringing litter boxes to school, I rolled my eyes in real life, which she totally clocked. But I could have said, I understand that. I hear you saying you're concerned about how kids are being taught in school. And maybe that would have opened a bit of a crack of empathy, of understanding between us if I had done that instead. Another technique that this group called Braver Angels uses is asking permission to weigh in on what somebody said. So just showing the respect that you really listened, and then showing that you're vulnerable to this conversation. Acknowledging this is a really hard thing to talk about. With my sister, we got into this big, not quite shouting match, but big back and forth about our older son who was about to get married to his boyfriend. And, she started spewing stuff from Leviticus about abomination at me. And my urban rural bridge training went through the roof at that. And, then we're like interrupting each other. And I finally thought of Mr. Rogers saying, use your words. And I took a deep breath and I said, look, if we're going to have any relationship at all, I don't think we can talk about this. And then she agreed. And then later in the conversation, she asked me a curious question about our older son. And it didn't change her mind. Like her values are so entrenched based on these Old Testament things that she's heard in her church over and over and over for decades that she's not going to change. But she at least, I saw her heart soften a little bit. She came to my book launch, even though she knew I was putting that conversation in the book because I ran it by her. So I just think extending grace, practicing grace, showing up for each other. A lot of people at my book events say, help, Thanksgiving's coming. And what do we do? And I say, do show up. You don't have to stay for hours and hours, but do show up. And then I go over some of these techniques. And then I try to keep it light by saying, you might need a kidney from this person one day. Like these are our family members. If we can't manage to talk to them, how are we going to talk to the person on the street who still has their Trump sign out, but who is actually our neighbor and, would bring our trash can in for us if we needed them to, we were out of town. We got to start to do this hard work. Is it scalable? I'm not sure, but we've got to try.
It's got to start someplace. So thank you for those hopeful words and just the use of the word grace, because I think that might be the key to it all.
Yeah.
Thank you, Beth.
You're welcome. I really enjoyed it.
We'll be right back with today's book trend.
Well, Brooke, surprise, our book trend today continues our ongoing 53-part series on AI. Yes, it's the subject that won't go away, and it's not going to go away, hence this news. A recent study found that while most professional writers are embracing AI tools, authors, especially fiction writers, are much more wary. And that isn't surprising to me, because if you mention AI to a lot of the fiction writers I know, many of them will eat a clove of garlic and hold up a cross to ward you off. You're a vampire, essentially. And the study, it's called AI and the Writing Profession. It collected responses from 1,481 working writers comprised of 1,190 writing professionals and 291 fiction authors. And what I think is interesting is that the majority of writers think that AI poses both a threat and an opportunity. 61% reported using AI tools, which they say, increased their productivity by an average of 31%, but only 7% of respondents have actually published AI-generated text. And so I have to admit that I'm in that 61% of people who use AI tools, but mainly for research. I'd actually kill for a 31% increase in productivity. I'm not finding that. But I do find it more interesting because that 7% of respondents who published AI-generated text, I don't know exactly what that means, but I know that you've got strong feelings about it, Brooke.
Ugh, I do. Man, it's just frustrating. I am really struggling with where I land on AI generated versus AI enhanced, because I have talked to a couple of people who are publishing books who used AI as a coach. That's their way of describing it. And one of them made a point to me that she spent thousands of dollars on a coach for her first book and used a lot of the suggested language that her coach gave her. And she doesn't see this support from AI as any different than that. I have to say this stumped me a little bit, Grant. It is different, of course, for me. But there are major ramifications too for the coaching profession and her not seeing a difference. But I also think these questions of how AI is different from a ghostwriter or a developmental editor whose comments you take is an interesting one, because writing has long involved publishing words that are not your own words, words that are generated by someone else. It's just that they've been humans and not this collective consciousness. But all of that philosophical musing aside, I'm very troubled by the infiltration of AI into publishing in general. I mean, anyone who reads my Substack will know that I've done a lot of pieces about AI. About the reporting, I do think that it's important to look at the figures when they're broken down for different kinds of writers. So the report found that the heaviest AI users are those in the thought leadership arena, 84%, PR and communications professionals, 73%, content marketing writers, 73%. Excluding fiction authors, the writing professionals least likely to use AI in their work were copy editors, journalists, and tech writers. But even still, those numbers were higher than I expected. But anyway, it makes sense to me that AI is used more in commercial realms and not so much in fiction and memoir. And then, of course, you and I, Grant, know people who are just, to your point, like, no way in hell. And I just, again, I struggle because I think I land there, but then I talk to people who are using it in different capacities, and it's hard for me to completely shut down their logic about why they're using it.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are experimenting. A lot of people are finding it useful in some way. I think it's especially going to be weird for the generation that actually grows up with it. I think then we're going to really see how it transforms writing and publishing. For daily use, I think the most popular AI-aided task is search, and I think that's one of the unrecognized things about AI is how dramatically it's changed this whole search industry. And then for less frequent tasks, the majority of AI users are using it, to suggest possible titles and headings, or for brainstorming, or as a thesaurus. So it's not exactly plagiarism,
Yeah, you can use it for all of those things, but you still have to be concerned about AI getting facts wrong, which is why those copy editors and journalists don't use it. I have found it gets a lot of things wrong, actually. And if you're not careful, you'll make a fool of yourself, and people definitely have.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if my fact checking of some AI research actually is taking me longer. I should have just done the research myself. But since I have spent most of my life, my writing life as a fiction writer, I find fiction writers' responses interesting. Only 42% said they use AI at least sometimes. Fiction writers who don't use AI, the report noted, are nearly unanimous in their disgust for the technology. So in keeping with the slew of copyright lawsuits authors have filed against AI companies, 100% of non-user fiction authors believe it's unfair to train AI tools on their work. I mean, I definitely agree with that, especially without compensation or permission.
Oh my gosh, 100% agree with that. I do hope this becomes an annual study, because I think it's going to be interesting to see the evolution of AI and how it's accepted or rejected by writers. And I see it becoming more and more mainstream, obviously. Like you said, I mean, these future generations they're growing up already with AI at their fingertips. And it's just, speaking of, befores and afters, it's just totally delineated by this monumental shift. We might use AI for research tasks. I would like to say, don't use it for your writing. I still believe it's important to write from the heart, to write your life like no technology will ever be able to. That is just so true. I have to say that I have seen some of my students do their own writing and then compare it to AI enhanced, and I always think that their own writing is better. So with that in mind, maybe it will keep you away from your chat bots while you're working on your memoir. But if you're using it as a coach, you are still invited to our community. We do want to say that. Come to the classes, keep listening to the podcast, but still happy non-AI writing.